Your role is no longer relevant. We need people who act faster. You're not as important as you think.
Speed can't replace understanding, and you just fired the only person capable of that. The game has begun.
I learned I was fired from a voice that didn't know my name. It spoke smoothly, confidently, as if reading weather updates, and it took exactly 3 minutes to end a career I had built for years. No meeting, no warning, no document, just a polite pause at the end, waiting for me to acknowledge receipt. Human Resources said the decision came from above. That was the entire explanation. When I asked who, the line went quiet, then careful. The CEO was unavailable. The COO was aligned. The head of IT suddenly had no calendar openings. Around the office, people avoided eye contact, the kind of silence that pretends loyalty while practicing survival. My name is Tanner Greene. I was the senior systems authorization architect, the person who designed and maintained the operational authorization chain that kept the company compliant, functional, and insured. I wasn't a support role. I wasn't optional. My work sat underneath everything, invisible by design, trusted because it never failed. The new COO didn't understand that, neither did the head of HR, who believed procedure mattered more than people and paperwork mattered more than memory. To them, I was a line item that could be removed quickly, cleanly, without disruption. 3 minutes felt generous. They asked for my badge. They asked for my laptop. They asked me to hand over access as if access was something you carried, not something you engineered, all the while. The systems continued running on logic I had written, reviewed, and personally signed off on for years. I stood there, listening, absorbing the insult, hiding inside the efficiency. Being erased by strangers who used my work daily felt less like termination and more like theft. As the call ended, a thought settled in quietly, almost politely. They hadn't just fired an employee, they had severed the only living link in their authorization chain, and they had done it confidently. Without asking what happens next, I didn't argue, because shock had already hardened into something colder, something patient, and I understood patience was about to become their most expensive mistake ever recorded. As you listen, I hope you're somewhere comfortable, maybe with a warm drink nearby, taking a quiet moment for yourself. However you're tuning in, don't forget to keep the small habits that take care of you, the ones that matter long after work hours end. Where are you listening from today? If stories like this speak to you, consider subscribing so we can keep these moments going together and stay with me. Because this was only the call. What came next is where everything started to unravel. I didn't build systems to impress anyone. I built them to survive bad leadership, careless shortcuts, and human ego. For my first year at the company, I designed authorization frameworks that assumed people would eventually make the wrong decision. The system wasn't elegant on the surface, it was deliberate, layered, and stubbornly resistant to individual control. Because compliance doesn't care who you are. Every audit we passed had my fingerprints on it, even when my name wasn't on the slide. I wrote controls that enforced separation of duties, fallback permissions, and escalation locks. I warned them repeatedly, calmly. Sometimes in writing, if the authorization chain breaks, the system doesn't crash. It protects itself. It freezes. That was never a threat. It was a design principle. The new COO laughed the first time I explained that. He liked dashboards, speed, and bold decisions. He called my approach conservative, outdated, and overly cautious. Human Resources agreed. Quietly. To them. I was a cost center who asked uncomfortable questions and slowed approvals. They wanted efficiency. I wanted accountability. Once, during a regulatory audit that nearly shut us down. I worked 3 nights straight tracing a permission conflict no one else understood. I fixed it hours before the deadline. The company passed. In the recap meeting, someone else took credit. I was told to stay quiet, to be a team player, to let leadership lead. That moment stayed with me, not because of the credit, but because I realized how invisible safety becomes once disaster's avoided. They forgot who held the line when it mattered. They forgot why the systems existed at all. So when the termination call came, I already knew something was wrong. Internal policy required documentation, a review, a sign-off. None of that happened. The process they claimed to respect was ignored without hesitation. No one objected. No one intervened. As I sat there, Anger pressed tight against my ribs, turning slowly into something heavier. Betrayal isn't loud, it's procedural. And then I remembered the final safeguard I had insisted on years earlier. The system's fail-safe mode didn't trigger immediately. It waited. 24 hours, exactly. That delay wasn't an accident or an oversight. It existed to give leadership time to correct mistakes without public damage. I had argued for it after watching executives panic and demand shortcuts. 24 hours was mercy built into code. Enough time to pause, to ask questions, to reverse a bad call. They never listened then. And they wouldn't listen now. I felt the weight of that choice settle in my chest. They believed authority replaced understanding. They believed systems obeyed titles. I knew better, because I had written the rules they were about to meet. It was the last quiet moment before consequence, before alarms without sound, before realization spread faster than any message they could draft inside the company walls. Nothing broke that afternoon. That was the part that made it almost peaceful. I packed my bag, walked past familiar desks, and left the building without resistance or ceremony. Behind me, servers hummed, dashboards refreshed, and approvals continued to flow as if nothing fundamental had changed. The COO even smiled during a hallway conversation, confident in the efficiency of his decision. HR looked satisfied, like a problem had been resolved neatly and permanently. I went home and did exactly what they didn't expect. I did nothing. I didn't log in remotely. I didn't send a warning email. I didn't leave a note explaining consequences or offering guidance. I didn't reach out to IT, legal, or compliance. Silence wasn't spite, it was discipline. Any interference would have softened the design and turned accountability into assistance. By early evening, the system began to behave exactly as intended. Small notifications appeared in the monitoring queue, subtle enough to ignore. A permission sync took longer than usual. A validation check requested confirmation that no one could provide. These weren't failures, they were questions, and questions are dangerous in organizations that reward speed over understanding. The alerts were reviewed, dismissed, and marked low priority. Someone assumed it was a temporary glitch. Someone else blamed a vendor update. No one connected the dots, because connecting dots requires memory, and memory had been removed 3 minutes at a time. I watched nothing. I waited. The calm was deliberate, engineered, and oddly reassuring. Systems don't panic. They escalate in steps, each one documented, predictable, and fair. People panic. That difference had always mattered to me. Later that night, the first department submitted a ticket reporting an access denial. The message was brief and confused. A user with the correct role couldn't complete a routine task. The system responded with a simple phrase, "Authorization Pending." That phrase triggered a checklist no one remembered how to complete. Still, no one called me. Confidence lingered longer than competence. The COO trusted hierarchy. HR trusted policy. Both trusted that control followed titles, not architecture. At exactly the point the safeguards were designed to engage, the system made its decision. It didn't shut down. It didn't crash. It shifted. Fail-safe mode activated quietly, locking dependent actions while preserving data integrity. Nothing was lost. Nothing was broken. Everything was paused. That was the moment I finally felt the waiting end, not with satisfaction or anger, but with certainty. The system had taken responsibility away from individuals who no longer qualified to hold it. From the outside, everything still looked fine. From the inside, every action now required an authority that no longer existed. They would notice soon, not because of noise or damage, but because progress would stop asking permission and start demanding understanding. I stayed still, letting the design speak for itself. Consequences rarely arrive loudly, but they arrive with precision and timing. By the next morning, panic had a rhythm. It moved from floor to floor, department to department, not as an explosion, but as a creeping realization that something fundamental was missing. People could log in, screens loaded, numbers refreshed, yet simple actions refused to complete. Approvals stalled, requests lingered. Every interruption returned the same neutral message: authorization pending. There was no error code to blame, no outage to explain away. At first, managers assumed user mistakes, then they assumed IT. Then, I'd assumed configuration drift. Meetings stacked on top of meetings, voices sharpened. The calm confidence from the day before evaporated, replaced by urgent questions no one could answer. The system wasn't broken. It was behaving exactly as designed, and that made it terrifying. The COO responded the only way he knew how. He demanded action. He ordered IT to override permissions manually, to open access long enough to keep operations moving. The request bounced back immediately. There was no override, no emergency switch, no backdoor. The controls were layered precisely to prevent improvisation during moments like this. The more pressure he applied, the clearer it became that authority alone carried no weight here. As the morning dragged on, the consequences widened. External partners started calling, transactions were flagged, automated compliance checks failed not because of data issues, but because no valid responsible officer could be confirmed. Banks paused transfers. Vendors delayed fulfillment. Each call followed the same pattern: polite concern. Then, quiet suspension until accountability could be verified. Fear settled in when legal joined the conversation without a recognized authorization holder. Contracts entered a gray zone. Every decision now carried personal risk. Executives who had signed confidently days earlier hesitated, suddenly aware that signatures meant exposure. The COO's tone shifted from commanding to defensive. HR stopped speaking altogether. In the middle of the chaos, someone pulled up the system architecture documents, desperate for guidance. Diagrams filled the screen, annotated carefully, methodically. My name appeared again and again, tied to foundational logic, approval paths, escalation limits, Tanner Greene, Senior Systems Authorization Architect. The recognition landed hard. I was still there, embedded in every layer, even though I no longer had a badge or an email address. That realization didn't calm anyone. It made things worse. They hadn't just lost an employee. They had removed the one person the system still recognized as complete. Every safeguard pointed back to an authority that had been officially erased from where I was. The panic felt distant but precise, like watching weather roll in on radar. Fear had replaced arrogance, and urgency had replaced certainty. The office was awake now, fully alert, staring at a problem they had created with confidence and ignorance in equal measure. And this was only the beginning. They found my number before noon. The call didn't come through HR's usual script or tone. It came carefully, almost politely, as if respect had suddenly been rediscovered overnight. The woman introduced herself slowly, confirmed my name twice, and asked how I was doing. That question alone told me everything had changed. I listened without interrupting. She explained there was confusion, that certain systems were behaving unexpectedly, that leadership wanted clarity. No apologies, but a softness that hadn't existed during the 3-minute call. I let the silence stretch long enough to remind her who was waiting on whom. When I finally spoke, I kept it simple. I said I was no longer an employee, and I had no obligation to assist. The line went quiet. Not disconnected, just stunned. Power doesn't announce itself when it shifts. It pauses. An hour later, legal called. This time there was no warmth, only precision. Questions about authorization layers, escalation keys, and responsibility assignments. I answered honestly and narrowly. I explained that the chain could not be reactivated without a valid authority. And at present, none existed inside the company. That was when the realization surfaced on their end. There was no executive override, no emergency credential, no temporary fix. The system didn't recognize titles or urgency. It recognized architecture, and that architecture pointed to one origin. They asked what it would take to confirm system status. I told them the truth. Only the original designer could verify and reestablish the authorization chain. Only the person who built it could certify it was safe to resume operations. Silence followed again, heavier this time. By then, control had quietly shifted. They weren't calling to instruct me anymore. They were calling to understand what they had broken. I felt no rush, no anger, only clarity. For years, I had been invisible by design. Now the design was visible, and it spoke without my help. I told them I would consider reviewing the situation. Nothing more. No promises, no timelines. Control isn't taken by force. It's claimed by restraint. Each minute they waited reinforced what authority really meant. Not access, not hierarchy, but accountability encoded into systems that refused to bend. This wasn't revenge. It was structure asserting itself after being ignored. They had removed the human layer and exposed the machine beneath it. Now they had to speak to it on its terms. As the calls ended, I felt the balance settle. They were searching for Tanner Greene. I was no longer hiding, no longer chasing approval. I was exactly where the system expected me to be. and for the first time since the call, everything was under control. Control didn't require my presence in the building anymore. It required acknowledgement of the design they dismissed, and acceptance that the rules now answering them were the ones I had already written years ago deliberately alone. I walked into the conference room without an invitation, and no one stopped me. Conversations died mid-sentence, chairs froze, half-turned. The silence didn't rush at me. It opened, controlled and sharp, like a system waiting for valid input. I didn't sit. I didn't smile. I stood where everyone could see me and where no one could pretend I wasn't real. The COO straightened first, already preparing authority, already rehearsing command. Human resources avoided my eyes. Legal watched me carefully, not with anger, but with calculation. I spoke before anyone could frame the moment for me. I said I hadn't come back for my job. Then I paused long enough for the words to register. I said I was there because the system was requesting the original designer of the authorization chain. Nothing more, nothing less. The COO laughed once, sharp and dismissive, and told me to either fix the issue or leave. He reminded the room that I was no longer employed, that access had been revoked, that decisions were no longer mine to influence. His voice rose with each sentence, trying to build power through volume. Legal cut him off. Not loudly. Precisely. They reminded him that no one in the room currently held valid authority recognized by the system. They reminded him that forcing action without confirmation could expose personal liability. The room shifted. That was the moment silence became loud. I explained calmly how the safeguards worked, why the chain had locked, and what conditions were required to restore continuity. I didn't touch a keyboard. I didn't log in. I didn't offer solutions. Explanation was enough. The design spoke through me without my hands. Someone asked how long resolution would take. I answered honestly. It depended on acknowledgement, documentation, and a willingness to accept the mistake that triggered the lock. The COO started to argue again, then stopped when legal placed a hand on the table. That restraint felt satisfying in a quiet way. I wasn't enjoying their discomfort. I was enjoying accuracy being respected after years of being ignored. Power had changed shape. It no longer needed permission or posture. When the meeting ended, nothing was fixed. That was the point. Control didn't come from restoring access. It came from understanding why access had been lost. As I walked out, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. The system wasn't waiting for me to save them. It was waiting for them to accept reality. And for the first time, they had no choice but to listen. That realization settled across the table like a verdict no appeal could touch. Titles meant nothing here. Authority had been translated into logic, and logic didn't negotiate. I left knowing the silence behind me would keep expanding, not because I returned, but because the system refused to forget. That truth stayed with them long after I was gone. I spoke slowly, not because the room needed drama, but because precision mattered now. Every sentence described consequence, not threat. Contracts paused without valid authority. Banks delayed settlements. Insurance coverage weakened. Compliance clocks restarted. Each ticking toward exposure leadership had never prepared for. I watched faces change as abstraction turned personal. Legal scribbled notes. Executives stopped interrupting. The COO leaned back, arms crossed, pretending calm. I explained that none of this was punishment. It was design behaving correctly after responsibility had been removed. When I mentioned personal liability, human resources finally looked up. The signature on the termination call wasn't abstract anymore. It carried weight. Internal policy had been bypassed, documentation skipped. That decision now sat squarely on the person who approved it. I didn't accuse, I didn't raise my voice. I simply clarified what regulators would ask first, and whose name would appear. Fear isn't loud when it's real. It drains color from a room and leaves everyone calculating exits. As questions slowed, the system advanced. A secondary lock engaged, one few people knew existed. Certain reporting functions froze. Audit exports halted. This wasn't escalation. It was containment, triggered automatically once uncertainty crossed a defined threshold. The COO demanded explanations again, but his tone had changed. Authority sounded thin without effect. Legal intervened before I could respond, advising restraint. Every additional command increased exposure. Silence, suddenly, was the safest option left to leadership. I explained the architecture once more. Clinically, layers existed to prevent panic decisions. Each lock protected someone downstream. Removing me had accelerated consequences, not created them. The system was doing exactly what years of risk analysis required. Human resources finally spoke, voice unsteady. Asking if anything could reduce the damage, I answered honestly. Acceptance mattered more than speed. Documentation mattered more than apologies. Accountability had to be restored before access could ever be discussed. That was when the tertiary safeguard activated. A deeper dependency locked, affecting external attestations. Insurance carriers flagged the status. Compliance notifications queued. No alarms, no drama, just quiet confirmation that containment was now comprehensive. I felt no anger then, only resolve. Consequences didn't require emotion. They required sequence. Design punished ignorance without intent. Watching leadership absorb that truth was enough. Justice, in this form, was procedural and unavoidable. The punishment wasn't personal, but it was precise. Every locked layer traced back to a documented decision. Accountability followed architecture. The more they resisted that logic, the more exposed they became, trapped inside a system that refused shortcuts. I could see understanding forming slowly, painfully. They had fired a role they never understood. What remained was consequence without villainy. Only structure executing rules that no longer cared who approved them internally. As the room emptied, containment completed itself. Another layer sealed, irreversible now. That final lock marked transition from warning to penalty, from theory to impact, and it closed without waiting for consent anyone. The board arrived without ceremony, and the atmosphere changed the moment they entered. Legal tension has a weight to it, different from panic, heavier and sharper. Questions stopped being hypothetical. Every word now carried consequence. I stayed standing near the wall, present but unannounced, watching authority recalibrate in real time. They began with the COO, not accusations, just facts. When was the termination approved? Which policy was followed? Who confirmed operational continuity? His answers sounded confident at first, then defensive, then circular. He spoke about efficiency, alignment, urgency. None of those words mattered anymore. The board wasn't interested in intent. They wanted process, evidence, and accountability. I was asked to explain my role, briefly. I did. I described the authorization architecture, the safeguards, and the conditions that triggered containment. No dramatics, no technical jargon meant to impress, just enough clarity to remove ambiguity. The more I spoke, the quieter the room became. Then I did something simple. I opened my laptop and forwarded a chain of emails to the board's counsel. They were dated months earlier, in them. I had warned leadership that removing the authorization owner without transition would activate system protections. I had requested a review. I had documented risks. The responses were short, dismissive, delayed. One message from the COO stood out. He thanked me for the theoretical concern and closed the thread. The board read in silence. That silence was different from before. It wasn't confusion. It was recognition. Questions resumed, sharper now. Why were these warnings ignored? Why was no contingency approved? Why did HR proceed without legal sign-off? The COO attempted to interrupt, to contextualize, to reassert control. The chair stopped him with a raised hand. Legal spoke next. Based on the information presented, continuing operations under current leadership posed unacceptable risk. The wording was careful, irreversible. The recommendation followed immediately. The COO was suspended pending investigation, effective immediately. There was no outburst, no shouting. Power doesn't collapse loudly when it's procedural. It evaporates. His badge was requested, access revoked in real time for the first time that week. A change happened cleanly. Documented. Correct. I felt no triumph, only release. The imbalance that had driven every escalation finally resolved itself. Authority had found its proper shape again, stripped of ego and restored to structure. As the meeting adjourned, board members thanked me quietly, not for fixing anything, but for preserving integrity when it was inconvenient. That distinction mattered. I hadn't caused the collapse. I had recorded the conditions that made it inevitable. When I left the room, the system remained locked, waiting. But now it was waiting for the right reason. Power had fallen. Not because I challenged it, but because it failed under its own neglect. Justice didn't arrive with speeches or apologies. It arrived as paperwork, interviews, and signatures that carried weight no one could redirect anymore. Human resources went first. Their decisions were reviewed line by line, their shortcuts documented, their confidence dismantled by process they claimed to protect. The COO's office was emptied quietly. Titles were removed from directories. Authority dissolved without ceremony. The company moved quickly after that. Lawyers negotiated terms. Insurers recalculated exposure. Partners demanded assurances that now required proof instead of promises. A settlement followed, structured carefully to contain damage and restore trust. No one celebrated it. Settlements aren't victories. They're admissions wrapped in legal language. I watched from a distance, detached but attentive. This phase wasn't about me. It was about correction. Systems correcting leadership, governance correcting ego. Every consequence traced cleanly back to a 3-minute decision that had skipped discipline in favor of speed. When they contacted me again, the tone had settled into something honest. There were no assumptions left, no leverage, only a request. They asked if I would verify and restore the authorization chain, not as an employee, but as an external consultant. The distinction mattered. It acknowledged what they had erased too easily before. I agreed under conditions: clear scope, written authority, independent status. The documentation took longer than the original termination call. That irony wasn't lost on anyone. Once finalized, I reviewed the system carefully, validating each layer, each dependency, each safeguard that had activated exactly as designed. I didn't rush. Restoration requires intention. When I confirmed the chain, systems unlocked in sequence, permissions returning only where accountability had been formally reassigned, operations resumed without drama, data remained intact, compliance clocks reset cleanly. The machine accepted the correction and moved forward. Only after everything stabilized did the final detail surface. Legal sent over the consulting agreement. The fee reflected urgency, risk, and responsibility. It exceeded my former salary by several multiples. No negotiation, no debate. Just acknowledgement of value, recognized too late. I signed without comment. Payment wasn't revenge. It was calibration. They now understood what expertise cost when it wasn't protected internally. The 3-minute call had purchased a lesson far more expensive than retention ever would have been. As I closed my laptop, I felt something settle. Justice had been procedural, not emotional. Payment had been precise, not indulgent. Nothing about this ending was loud or dramatic. It was clean. The system was whole again, and so was my position within it. The price had been paid, not in anger, but in correction. And that, I realized, was the only kind of ending that lasts. Authorization returned quietly, the way it should. Systems don't celebrate, they resume. Dashboards stabilized, queues cleared, transactions flowed again, each step verified and logged. From the outside, it looked like recovery. From the inside, it was correction, deliberate and complete, the kind that leaves no room for denial or shortcuts later. The building felt different even from a distance. No hurried emails, no emergency meetings spilling into hallways. The COO's name was gone from internal directories. The old HR leadership no longer appeared on approval chains. Interim roles had replaced them, wrapped in oversight and review. Decisions now required signatures that carried weight, context, and memory. The machine had learned, because someone had finally listened to what it was built to say. I walked away without needing to look back. I wasn't reclaiming a desk or a title. I was reclaiming alignment. The system no longer depended on me personally. And that was the point. Good architecture is meant to free people once responsibility is understood and respected, not bind them indefinitely. In the days that followed, messages arrived from people who had stayed silent before. Short notes, careful words. Gratitude mixed with relief, I replied selectively, not out of bitterness, but clarity. This story had never been about loyalty or popularity. It was about consequence, measured and unavoidable. Power, I realized, had never belonged to those who spoke the loudest or moved the fastest. It belonged to those who understood what held everything together when pressure arrived. Firing someone is easy. Undoing the damage of that decision is expensive, slow, and public. Especially when systems refuse to forget. What satisfied me wasn't the consulting fee or the apologies offered too late. It was watching governance replace ego, seeing restraint become policy, knowing shortcuts now carried a visible cost. One leadership would remember before acting again. I hadn't defeated anyone. I hadn't exposed secrets or forced confessions. I had simply allowed design to finish its sentence. Justice didn't arrive as revenge. It arrived as balance restored, precise and unemotional, as my involvement ended. The company moved forward cautiously, permanently changed, Processes hardened, reviews lengthened. Silence became a sign of consideration, not fear. That shift mattered more than any headline or internal announcement ever could. I took my time stepping into what came next. There was no rush anymore. The tension that once lived in my chest had lifted, replaced by a steady satisfaction that comes from seeing things placed back where they belong. They thought 3 minutes was enough to end me. They didn't know those minutes were only when the system began to remember. This story reminded me that real strength isn't loud, and justice doesn't need anger to be effective. Sometimes the most powerful response is patience, preparation, and letting systems reveal the truth people try to ignore. I'm curious, how did this story make you feel as you listened? Was there a moment or detail that stayed with you longer than the rest? And where are you listening from today? If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like and share it with someone who might need this reminder. And if you enjoy stories that explore quiet justice and real consequences, consider subscribing. You're always welcome here.